Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our weekly Improving Talk session as we continue with this month's series, Bleeding Edge Technology, Unlocking the Future of Human Innovation. My name is Armando Lopez from the Improving Mexico Enterprise, and I am thrilled you could join us today. But now, let me introduce our amazing host for today, Daniel Scheffler. Daniel is a principal consultant from our Houston enterprise with experience in e-commerce, telemedicine, and oil and gas. As an electrical engineer turned software developer, he prides himself on highly disciplined developing, leading to more effective products and processes. He is a problem solver at heart and leverages this strength in applying industrial theory to the challenges of software development. He also fearlessly leads this amazing Improving Talks initiative. When not engaged in coding, you'll find Daniel playing with his children, reading, or tinkering, whether in the workshop or in a computer. In today's session, Think Like a Brain, the Quiet Neuromorphic Revolution, gotta love that name. Daniel will explore how neuromorphic chips are reshaping edge AI, low power, brain-like speed, and real-world impact. Pretty cool stuff if you ask me. Before we start, please remember that we have a Q&A feature so you can ask questions at any time, and Daniel will answer them live. And without further ado, I leave you with Daniel Scheffler as he takes us on this journey to learn more about the quiet neuromorphic revolution. The microphone is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Armando. As always, you do a wonderful job. I'm gonna have a hard time following that up. But hey guys, welcome to Think Like a Brain, the Quiet Neuromorphic Revolution. Yes, I'm quite proud of that title, but let's get into it. Today, the goal here is, I'm gonna go a little bit over who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. We're gonna cover what's the big deal first, because neuromorphic chips make some absolutely incredible claims. And I'd like to demonstrate some of their fact that they are in fact quite credible. And of course, that's going to require a small physics primer. Don't worry, we're not going to dive into everything, but we are going to have to touch into integrated circuits a little bit and some history. I'll keep it high level for you, don't you worry. Then we're going to talk about the difference that the neuromorphic architecture actually makes, round it out with some real case studies showing value already, and then take a look ahead at how this will affect the market and your options going forward. So, quick coverage, right? Who am I? My name is Daniel Scheffler. I'm a Christian husband and those 5 kids I've got in the background. But what doesn't always show up on this is that I did, in fact, go to school and graduated magna cum laude with a degree in electrical engineering and computer engineering. I studied this science. And so as a result, the moment I heard we wanted to do a talk on neuromorphic chips, I geeked out hard. I've been spending months researching and digging into this topic, so I am excited to share some of the findings I've had with you, as well as what I believe that's going to mean for our industry, that is custom software development, in the future. Now, let's start with the end in mind. What's the big idea? Traditional AI at the edge is power hungry, right? It is taking us a ton of power, a ton of cooling, and a ton of time to be able to produce LLMs and a variety of other models. Machine learning takes compute. That's a basic fact of life. But watt for watt, neuromorphic chips are a game changer, especially in reactive edge computing scenarios. To give you AI-like power, provided you can write the algorithm, in a low power setting. This is, they sip at the battery rather than chug it like a giant. We're looking at results in things like computer vision, medical wearables, industrial IoT cases. Hint, hint, those are coming up later. But here's the thing. This incredible claim just relies on the fact of physics and a little bit of the manner in which we use it. So I'd like to walk you guys through a bit of a primer. How exactly is it that I can declare low power AI at the edge equals neuromorphic, where we stare at it and say, I mean, my dude, the amount of compute or the cooling required to keep these big AI GPU chips running is enormous. Why would I ever have that in an IoT situation? Let's start back at the beginning. Back in the beginning, chips weren't chips, exactly. In fact, chips is a fairly modern concept by comparison, because you see, we've been doing this computing stuff since the radio. And it started with vacuum tubes. Invented in 1906, these were great for a variety of computing situations, including basic amplification, radio transmission and reception, and tuning. Here's the thing. There's a reason why audiophiles will swear by vacuum tube technology. The frequency response of vacuum tube technology is infinitely better than digital, at least digital when it first came out, because these computers simply compute at the speed of physics. We used to have mathematical machines written in vacuum tube technology because nature made use of things like the voltage law for multiplication. And so I could get multiplication and division, no problems. Voltage addition is straightforward and easy. I could even get complex logarithmic behavior if I made use of things like inductors or capacitors in these sequences. And by the way, vacuum tubes do that. We were computing at the speed of physics, but it's huge, it's chunky, easy to break, oops, and it releases a ton of heat. Not to mention getting this thing calibrated and stable is a pain and a half. But that's where we started. Analog computers doing computation at the speed of physics, not at the speed of a clock. You see, that's actually one of the major differences we had. The next major revolution, as it were, in computing really came around with the transistor. Originally invented in Bell Labs in 1947, we didn't get a ton of traction on these things until we got the MOSFET, or the metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. Mouthful, so we're just going to call it a MOSFET. That was invented in 1959, oddly enough, at TI. Well, there's some debate on that. But we ended up trading off our variable voltage response for an either on or off system. Hello, binary. Now, binary has some pretty great advantages, right? It's extremely clear on the signal. I don't have to worry about like issues in the circuitry itself affecting whether or not I can process the signal because I've started getting degradation in old circuits. Now, as long as the signal transmits and I get the right voltage, I know it's either a 1 or a 0. The real problem comes with how do I coordinate a whole bunch of those so that the computation, now having to represent a complex number in binary, all happens together and I don't end up with like, this binary bit from that number and this binary bit from that number and I get confused halfway through. Well, the solution we chose for this was to control the voltage at the gate. The gate is the thing that either turns on or off the transistor, allowing us to actually propagate my signal, the computation result, as we go through. But it is all down to controlling the voltage at the gate. And so how do we synchronize a bunch of transistors? Clock the gate signal. And so now, as a result, while the physical transition of the transistor does take a modicum of time as I modify the semiconductor through the wonderful physics that make this happen, I am now honestly computing as fast as I can get the clock to signal through. This does not mean that I am computing fast. In fact, it started pretty slow. If you guys think of today, you'll look at your CPU, right? It'll say, oh, I compute at 3.5 gigahertz. Hertz is the number of clock flops per second. 3 gigahertz is billions of flops per second. This is enormous. But what are we doing with those flops, those bit flops? Well, that's how I go about converting an analog signal into digital. I am sampling really fast. Maybe this sampling is by tenths of a second. This is terrible sampling, but it's a good example, right? I am taking an approximation, that being a very important thing here. I'm taking an approximation of a real world signal, voltage flowing through the air or a radio wave or light, as we tend to use for the internet. I'm seeing an approximation, not the actual value. And with a fine enough approximation, this doesn't really matter, right? But you can see how I've got these like slightly under and slightly over spaces in each of my transitions. Where right here, slightly before the signal, I'm slightly above. And then slightly after the signal, I'm slightly below. But it's about the average. It's about right. But if my signal starts changing faster than my sampling rate, I run into problems. And so right now, where we find ourselves today, especially on the cusp of the AI revolution, is with clocks that are moving far faster than a human can measure and far faster than most of the signals we choose to process. As a result, digital has now unlocked lots of simple operations and approximations very fast. But keep in mind, it is always on the clock. Never does it run without the clock saying go. You kind of get a sense of that rhythm here. That's my limiting factor. How fast can I flip the clock? Now, over time, of course, this led to the effect of, well, Moore's law. How do I get more with less? Well, our technology got better. Once I had digital, I had finer grain control, finer approximations, and I could shrink the volume or the area taken to have each of these MOSFET transistors in a chip. Moore's law states that the transistor count roughly doubles every 2 to 2.5 years, a logarithmic type growth, wonderful thing. Practically what that means, it means I could get twice the number of computations in the same physical space. and maybe on a faster clock cycle. And you see that graph here shows this compounding growth curve over time as things accelerate as we go. And over this time, we've had transitions in the technology. Like down here, we started with MOSFETs. As we get up here, we start getting to junction gates. And even up here, we're starting to get three-dimensional transistor architecture, all at the nanoscale. But as transistors became cheaper, we started to apply the technology in novel ways. One of those examples is in memory, right? Your computer now has absolutely bananas levels of memory compared to what we started with, right? Used to be that 30 megabytes cost you $300, and it was a great big old hard drive. And now for the same price, I can get 4 terabytes. By the way, that's an 6 orders of magnitude larger number. We've had stupid amounts more memory going through this. Heck, at this point, you can get like a solid state drive made of transistors for about the same price that is wickedly faster than the old disk drives. And by the way, resistant to physical problems now, because I am now storing memory in an electrical state rather than a physical state. Long live the USB stick. But cheaper memory, higher transistor counts, they don't solve all of our problems altogether. Rather, we discovered some new ones. Namely, that the CPU was designed to solve mathematical equations in succession, one step at a time in this sequence, because it was designed to implement the steps of a program. Move this here, add this together, give me the result, send the result over here. The program, a procedure. But when I start dealing with multidimensional math, or I have to do a lot of things all at once to get to my final answer, say in graphical processing, I start running into challenges with this single-threaded process. And this is where we now start seeing the GPU emerge over time, where the CPU is this single-lane highway trying to go as fast as it can through that one operation, maybe with several CPUs. The GPU is a collection of all of this together all at once. GPUs entered the market in 1970s, 1980s-ish, with new mathematical approaches and models being developed. Now, yes, video games did help rise and propel this, but there are countless uses of multidimensional mathematics at play, from financial analysis to geophysical simulation. GPUs advanced by approaching the problem in a different way. And this visual kind of gets you a sense of, well, what's that difference? Right? CPU is designed to follow a sequence of instructions in that order. And GPU is designed to compute a long series of potentially related equations that may or may not be contingent on one another. GPUs enabled greater parallelism by offloading a class of mathematical computations off of the CPU. So the CPU now manages other things. And now your game runs at 50 frames per second, smooth as glass, which now leads us to this state which we find ourselves in today. The current rise of AI has been built on the back of CPU and GPU technologies, which have novel approaches and the new software to achieve it. The companies that are positioned to ride this surge generally found themselves in that position because they were already leaders in GPUs, see NVIDIA, and NVIDIA just leaned harder into it, owning the training chips. Meanwhile, other chip makers like AMD are working to either play catch up or are putting themselves on the inference side of the game, which is the chip that will run your LLM or your neural network model. But the models mostly improved through more data, through more compute running through the training cycle. And recently in the news, we've been seeing that like the ChatGPT 5, we're reaching the limit of what more data, more training can do. The last rounds that had easily twice as much training, and we're talking the trillions of dollars, had a marginal improvement in performance and didn't match state-of-the-art in any of the training tests. We've hit a critical mass of data, and it's probably about as far as just raw training on all the information on the internet can get us. But even with that, look at what it's enabled, right? We've got agentic systems able to spit out novel code based upon an English set of requirements. Some debate on whether the quality is there yet. We have the ability to now have the agent make informed stock decisions based upon public information it can pull itself. Or research agents who can now go and explore the internet for us. And all of that is based upon the ability to run compute fast. But one area it continues to run shallow is where I am at the edge, where frankly digital meets reality, with how do I get this connected for a real world system, an existing factory, for example, with the need to sense and respond in real time. But here I'm going to take a moment to pause because that That was our physics primer. That's all just to set us up for, okay, so you said this neuromorphic thing was going to be a whiz bang. I'm with you today. What's next? You see, neuromorphic chips, where the CPU is the multi-lane highway trying to go to one destination really, really, really fast. GPUs are, hey, let's have all of us go together all at once. Neuromorphic chips are more like a city street map, where you might start down here and you navigate your way up, maybe around this little roundabout, and find your way meandering through the city, where another signal might realize that it can get faster by following the waterway and then get out faster. The neuromorphic chips have what feels more like a dynamic computing result, right? CPUs, one instruction at a time, GPUs blaze through a bunch of parallel equations. Neuromorphic chips work more like you and I do, where there's a spark of input that then begins to propagate through the network as it goes, based upon the state the network's already in or what happened before, and then eventually reaches a point where it starts generating outputs as the result of how the signal propagates in a seemingly spiking neural network fashion, where we start with neurons spiking and flashing at each other as they realize, hey, the input's reached a high enough level, we need to do something. So this signal working its way through methodically fixed routes versus the input of a neuromorphic chip that literally flows through the circuit is a change towards real-time computing. The chip responds in real time to circumstances as it finds them, whereas the CPU has to respond based upon the result of a sequence of computations. The GPU responds to a sequence of computations it knows it needs to do. The neuromorphic chip can respond in novel fashion with seeming new neural paths opening up as the chip responds in real time to what it is discovering. And it's capable of it flowing through with a large number of computations simultaneously, all going on at the same time inside the neurons, means that it's a multifaceted interpretation of that data on top of everything. Now, if that's not enough, these chips do so for less power than either the CPU or the GPU will require doing the same instance of work because of that clock issue. Now, I'm going to take a jump to this next step and describe the architecture a little bit more, right? Von Neumann architecture is the typical one we use for integrated circuits. The neuromorphic architecture is a little different, right? So I want you to think of it, this neuromorphic chip, as a set of neurons where each neuron is a small little light bulb that will flash briefly when it sends a signal to neighbor neurons, right? And the pattern and timing of these flashes carries important information, similar to how you'd see it in Morse code. Now, yes, I'm borrowing a quote here, but I think this was the best description I found in my research for what's going on. Neurochips go back to the roots, very similar to analog circuitry, where instead of using a clock to synchronize transistor outputs, the memory and processing elements are tightly interlinked. In the von Neumann architecture, memory and inputs and compute are all separated, connected by paths, and the information travels along those sideways on synchronous clocked moments. I'm only allowed to have all of this shift through the bus at once, and then I stop, and then a different thing shifts through the bus. In neuromorphics, it's a series of connections that are made or broken or sent signals as we flow through the circuit. Now, moreover, these neurons aren't simply responding they just don't respond if there's no signal. In a CPU, every register in the CPU is active the moment the clock signal goes up. The moment it goes down, it shifts to off. And each transition is a little bit of energy being lost. Neuromorphics don't have that same limitation because if it's off, I'm off. I'm not changing voltage. The moment I change voltage, there's electrical work going on and I have to spend energy. This is where that low power option comes through. Now, all of this combines to make neuromorphic chips a powerful contender for high computing situations in a very particular niche, specifically AI at the edge. And it's no longer a dream, but is actively on the horizon. And we're not talking like flying cars out of the Jetsons, which is a hollow old promise any of us remember and are kind of a little steamed that it's not real. And this is more like, hey, that self-driving car just got a lot more affordable and a lot more effective at avoiding collisions after we send it to high school, which now allows me to talk about our case studies. Now, I'm going to hold back on the geeking out and I'm going to focus more on the business applications of what's going on here. But the physics behind this is fascinating and the abilities that it's unlocking are amazing. Not going to say we live on the best timeline, but we're getting pretty close. So let me talk about AI at the edge in an IoT setting, specifically industrial IoT. We have unlocked mimicry, robot mimicry of humans, robot see, robot do, in less than a millisecond. With the SNNs spec chip, That little robot you see in that GIF is mimicking the sensed motions of an arbitrary participant at the conference with a sub-millisecond latency to determine what did I do. And that sensor is running on milliwatt levels of power. So battery applications, we're talking battery for days because it only processes it when it sees something. This is a massive potential, not as a technology on its own, though. You see, the real interest in this is what it will enable a partner technology, in this case, humanoid robots, to do. You can think of it like this. If I don't have to create a fancy algorithm to train, like artificially program a robot to do all these things and to react to situations in the field, and can instead just say, follow the human and do what it does, there is a massive amount of potential for what this now human-shaped robotic tool can do. Imagine being in a foundry, hot, sparks, risk of metal falling on top of you. Imagine being able to eliminate entirely a business risk from, well, an industrial accident. Because you put your humans in a VR system and you have your robots actually in the foundry. And the robots are just following what the human says it should be doing. The human's getting feedback from what the robot sees and now pilots the robot rather than teaches it. Or heck, you could do teaching as well to show the robot, here's how you handle a pallet. These kind of options are becoming available to us right now with some caveats. Now, as another example, right, there are other chips like this in the industrial IoT setting. The Intel Loihi chip processor can essentially sense and process data at AI levels for milliwatt power consumptions, making it ideal for remote monitoring in situations like the oil and gas rigs. Here I am sitting with a massively powerful chip that will run only when I need it to and be able to, on its own, last for days. These operations suddenly become a lot cheaper when you consider the kind of situations we want IoT for. I know what you're saying. Wait a minute, Daniel, you started with industrial robots, but I want you to tell me about my self-driving car. That was the thing you hooked me on here. Well, never you worry. We're also looking at one of the benefits of neuromorphic chips in their massive parallel processing potential. Again, we've already seen how fast it's able to mimic a person dancing on screen. Well, the same capabilities, this time in the prophecy chip, are allowing us to process LiDAR and camera inputs with sub-millisecond latency. And by the way, for those of you who are keeping score, that's at the equivalent of like 10,000 frames per second. Most of the camera in the video you're watching right now is probably running on 24, just for scale, right? That's the equivalent temporal precision of what is going on around me. This means that collision avoidance without cloud reliance is not only going to be available to the cars, which it's so far so good, but to be able to do so on a smaller chip with taking less power and less extra requirements. This is a massive opportunity as someone begins to operationalize this technology. And again, there's one of those caveats I have to tell you about towards the end of this talk. But your car goes from, well, I can kind of see it and I can kind of sense it. And let's be honest, Tesla has one of the best chips for this already. We're talking about a non-Tesla brand chip enabling all the other car manufacturers to get similar levels or better of performance once the tech is operationalized. 10,000 frames per second of processing, sub-millisecond latency of, oh no, to slamming on the brake. For context, humans, we've actually already done the math on this. Like humans take a quarter of a second to react, to even see there's a thing, and then it's a blip of processing before your muscles try and slam on the brake. We're talking about this thing doing so an order of magnitude or two faster than a human can, and doing so now for small energy on a customized chip for this purpose. Some pretty great opportunity here once the technology is there. And like I said, it means that your self-driving car gets a lot better in a period of about how long it takes us to go to high school. Once we have the manufacturing and especially the commercialization up and running for it. Now, one of the other things I've been selling you is on this low power means long life. Let me give you an example on this, right? One of the examples that has been tried out with neuromorphic chips for processing has been on radiation detection and radiation monitoring around the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, their neurogrid experiment. And you see an example there of about how big this thing is. It's honestly about the size of a football. But you see that little blue square there? That's the battery. That's a standard, 3-cell LiPo battery? Rechargeable, like kids' toys? And they were able to leave this thing out in the field. And they will give you the caveat. Their research says the length of the battery life will depend upon how many cycles the thing is active. This is one of those caveats. Remember, it only spends power when it's processing. And it only spends processing when it realizes that things are at a level it needs to do something about. So if you've got a problem, it's more likely to spend more power. But if you don't have a problem, it's just going to sleep and wait. And so it's monitoring that giant silver tube for radiation. And when it sees radiation, it's going to run some calculations to see if it's a problem and log it, and maybe raise an alert. But all of this on the power that your kid's remote control car is already running on. And it's sipping at this. Milliwatts of power per active cycle. And we're looking at batteries that have hundreds of watts easily of power waiting. This is the scale we're talking about. But of course, as with all things, it doesn't come free. So here's the thing I need you to remember as we go through with this, right? Traditional versus neuromorphic chips. This is the breakdown of their major differences, right? Traditional are clock-driven processing. I can only process it when all of my computations are done together, and I synchronize those by a clock, one step at a time. And each step burns power. So where a traditional approach to most of these problems would be to have a CPU running, constantly clocking through as fast as it can, constantly spending power, even when nothing is happening. The neuromorphic chips are there and waiting for voltage signals to rise high enough to say, whoa, got a spark and do something now. As a result of the continuous processing, these traditional applications for CPUs or GPUs have a high power consumption rate. And of course, as I mentioned, they require explicit programming for all of the situations. By contrast, neuromorphic chips are event-driven. Something happened on the circuit to drive the voltages high enough to say, okay, I got to do something now. And since they're event processing, that means the periods where there's no events or very few is a low power consumption period, allowing you to stretch the existing battery tech we've already got much longer than we can do with the traditional applications. Now, there is the ability for the system to have emergent programming properties. And this is one of those areas where, because it's an emerging technology, it's harder to describe what this will do because even our own models for describing it aren't accurate yet. But local level learning rules and a degree of synaptic plasticity, where it'll react, and then, oh, hold on, the system is going to stop reacting too much because it's been doing that for too long. And then it'll morph into a new path to continue the reaction despite this one being saturated. Or as the program runs and we start seeing patterns emerging, we see that the common pathway the signals are traveling along follows a pattern, and that pattern emerged rather than was being explicitly programmed in. All of this will emerge over time from both the nature of the circuitry itself, as well as from the emergent types of algorithms that are being developed for the spiking neural network chip. Because the way you describe for the chip to respond, the way you program it, is fundamentally different than what we do today, even though it's going to be founded on very similar principles. Your self-driving car going to high school and suddenly getting a lot better, or the long-term sensing applications for fairly risky individuals or risky situations. And all of that predicated on how our chips just are fundamentally different. Well, there are some challenges ahead. As I was just mentioning, right? It's a novel hardware. It's not widely available right now, which not only means that it's difficult to develop on because the techniques aren't there yet, it's even difficult to test on, which means that we end up with ourselves in this standard loop, right? It's a new technology, so there's only a few experienced developers, which means it's a bigger business risk. So fewer businesses try, which means there's less opportunity for experienced developers to develop, which feeds the cycle all the way through again. And that's going to remain true for easily the next couple of years while this comes out. But if you want to explore what the technology can do, the libraries, I'm pleased to announce, are growing and are stabilizing as we speak. You would want to look at the Pine library, Pynn, which allows you to simulate neural networks. This is a great way for your company to test whether a neural network and especially a neuromorphic chip architecture might be useful in your niche scenario by a simulation. It doesn't eliminate the business risk, true enough, but a little bit of work in simulation is a much smaller cost than buying a lot of chips from a manufacturer and hoping they'll be useful. Much better to write up some software, which can be thrown away at the end of the day if you need, to test whether the idea even has traction. And once you've gone from, I'm pretty confident from the simulations it's worth trying a POC, you'll want to switch to Lava, which is the same library that the Intel Loihi chips were using to program the neuromorphic chips themselves. So it translates from a Python simulation to a new code base, which has some, what do you call it? Library connectors for like C or C# and Python to help you get the algorithm I created in my simulation now applied to a real circuit. But so much for the challenges that are ahead. Let's talk opportunities. Where could this grow? Healthcare is the first place I come to thinking of this. I have heard of these chips being used to help actively monitor patients on a variety of health schematics, including like leading indicators of a cardiac event or checking on their blood pressure as well as like their blood sugar levels, all via a medical wearable. I believe that there's a massive potential for these, especially if they become a standard product distributed to all patients in a hospital, to massively improve our patient monitoring as well as their ability to care for them. Speaking of those, that's not the only place this thing has an opportunity to rise. There were use cases, which I haven't included here, that explored what it would be like to use this in an IoT setting, but more for like a government system or other passive systems where I want to monitor how the road's doing or how the intersections are doing or the flood levels without constantly having to replace the battery in this way out there piece of tech. There's a massive potential for cost savings there. And of course, as I mentioned, with the paired technologies on the rise, this will likely see an improvement as well from self-driving cars or the follow me protocol for humanoid robotics. This is where those neuromorphic chips will have the chance to shine. And they're industries that I don't think are going away anytime soon. Now, with every new technology, there are both strengths and weaknesses, and neuromorphic has its fair share, right? It is a brand new paradigm for computing, which means novel models. We have a lot of brain work to do before this thing is going to be really useful. And especially it's going to take the form of developing new algorithms, right? How does processing look on a chip whose architecture isn't about running straight math, but ends up being about how do I process the signal from multiple directions and how do I choose to propagate it? Now, the good news is that this can mostly be built on existing skills we have in the industry. Data science, basic computer programming, all of these will still be useful. They'll simply be applied in new ways. Just like back when I was in college, they taught us, here's how you do processing of a list or a binary tree. And yes, even things like the fancy algebraic syntax to figure out what the computer was supposed to be doing kind of dynamically on whatever it's doing. This same kind of thought process is going to be used to create the new opportunities and honestly leverage the strengths of the chip. Now, this is, of course, still subject to physics, right? At no time have we absolved ourselves of the need to deal with entropy. No. The chips run less frequently and therefore save battery life. The situations that still hold IoT applications back, like how do I dissipate the heat from compute, still apply here too. In particular, heat under load is something you'll need to pay attention to because if you start having a lot of load all at once, you've got to get rid of the heat and it's gonna burn through it really, really fast. So managing that and dealing with it is important. The second thing to remember, the battery life depends on your active versus sleep ratio. How often are you active? How often are you asleep and for how long? Because the switching is what spends the energy. So while these chips have the potential to have a massive battery savings, it depends on how frequently you run them. So you're going to have to pick your targets. But given the right tuning and these new algorithms built up over time, these chips will be absolutely game changer. No other chip, watt for watt, can do or match what a neuromorphic chip can in their niche. AI at the edge in low power scenarios are the place where neuromorphic chips are going to shine. And it already has potential in medical wearables, in driving cars, or mimicry of robotics. It will depend upon the rise of both new classes of human intelligence and application. It will also depend upon the rise of partner technologies to make this thing productive. With that, I'd like to take a moment to pause and say, all of this I want to make available to you, but I want to ask for your feedback. This has been a topic where I've been geeking out super hard, but I'd like to share the slides with you so that you can take them, explore some of the links that are definitely embedded in those, and go look at the use cases yourself to see if this technology is going to be a fit for you. So go ahead and scan that QR code, answer a few questions, and I will send to you a PDF of all of these slides from today so you can take it and share this knowledge too.